So now we have Simon Peter today, the leader of the disciples. And we just named off the disciples. We got about 8 out of the 12, so really good job. We're learning. Hopefully by the end we can name all 12 and keep that in our memory. Adult learning is all about repetition, right? Keep saying it over and over again. Eventually you'll remember it. Or maybe something will sink in. So, Simon Peter. All right, so little overview about Simon Peter. This is what we're going to go over. We're going to talk about his occupation, his family. We're going to talk about how he found Christ, or how Christ found him. His nickname from Jesus, because of course when you get a name from God, it's very important. The life after the resurrection, him being an early church leader, and of course martyrdom, because being a disciple of Jesus also meant that you were martyred. Where do we see Simon Peter in the Bible, and also what his contributions are. And here is a statue of Simon Peter in Rome. I think it's at St. Peter's Square, right by St. Peter's Basilica. So, okay. So you probably already know, Simon is probably the most famous disciple. He's mentioned the most in the Bible. His occupation was fisherman. So he's one of the few disciples that have a named occupation, right? And we can see him fishing in the New Testament. So he had a fishing business with his brother Andrew, and then the other disciples, James and John, were also fishermen, and they kind of had like a business together. And so also, if you go fishing in the Sea of Galilee, there is a fish there, and it's called St. Peter's fish, and it is a tilapia. So, and next time you go out to eat, or you cook at home, if you're cooking tilapia, you can think of St. Peter, or the disciple Peter, and you're eating St. Peter's fish. I'm sure that the fish tastes much better in Galilee, other than the farm-raised stuff that we get in the supermarket. So if you're ever in Israel, maybe you can try one of these St. Peter's fish. Okay, so we know according to the Bible that he lived in both Bethsaida and Capernaum, and so we have a little map here showing us where all these things are. So Jesus from Nazareth living over here, right? And then we have the Sea of Galilee. Sea also can be confused with the word lake. They mean the same thing, basically. And so we have the Lake of Galilee. It's a pretty decent sized lake. It's about 8 miles wide and 13 miles long. So it's not this ginormous body of water, but it is pretty big, right? And so we can see up here we have Capernaum and Bethsaida, and these are two of the places where Peter is said to have lived in the New Testament. And you'll see here too, this whole area around in here, that's not showing up. This area all right here is the Galilean area, right? And so much of Jesus's early ministry is taking place in this Galilean area. So we have Nazareth right here, and then we have Capernaum and Bethsaida there. And so that's where much of the early New Testament stories take place. So it's always good to see things on a map, right? You always just hear these names, and now you can actually be like, oh, that's where they're talking about. So continuing with our map, let me squeeze by here. Made some notes on here. All right, so this is Israel, right? And so we have up here, once again, the Sea of Galilee. Capernaum would be up here. And then I'm pointing arrows to this big, long Jordan River. We know that John the Baptist did much of his ministry going up and down the Jordan River, baptizing people in it. So it's a pretty important part of the New Testament. You can see we're kind of far away from the Mediterranean Sea. We're very much inland here. But you can also see where Jerusalem is, right? And Jerusalem is very, very important at that time for Judaism, right? And so do you find it strange that Jesus takes a lot of men from this Galilean area instead of the Jerusalem area, right? Now, this area actually has a lot of Old Testament meaning to it, right? There's a lot of things that happened up in this area. I believe the prophet Elijah spent a lot of time up in there. So it has a lot of religious context, but at the time, everybody's in Jerusalem, right? And that's where like the main capital of Judaism is at the time. So you can kind of see that's a pretty big distance. I think it's like 120 miles. So if that gives you any context, it's a few days journey, right, by walking. So okay, family. Obviously, these people have family, right? Very many people don't have a family unless you're abandoned at birth. So here we go. We have family. Peter's one of the few people that's mentioned of having more than just like a brother in the New Testament. So we know that he was married because the mother-in-law is mentioned. One of Jesus's early miracles is going to either the house of Simon Peter or his mother-in-law's house, and she was sick, and he heals her right there in the house, and he heals her so quickly that she gets up and starts being a good host to all the people in her home, right? And so we know for that fact that Simon Peter was married. There are no children mentioned, so not much we can talk about that. Find it very strange that there were no children mentioned, but you know, in the Bible, it's all about who your father is, not necessarily who your children are, right? So maybe he had children, maybe he didn't, but since the Bible doesn't tell us, it's probably not important. So his brother was Andrew, right? Who was also a disciple. We'll talk about him next. And he's referred to as the son of Jonah. So Simon, son of Jonah, not the famous Jonah with the whale. And so it's just another name for John, right? Because like Captain Harry was saying today, you're often known by your father, right? So when he is called Simon, son of Jonah, it's just, you know, everybody knows your father. Back home, I could meet somebody and they might know my last name or not, and they would be like, who's your dad or who's your grandfather, right? And if they were like a farmer in the area, I could say, oh, my grandfather's Dean Robbins. And they'd be like, oh, I know Dean, because everybody knows Dean because he's loud and he tells lots of stories, and you meet him once, you'll never forget him, right? Or my other grandfather was a sign maker in the town of Millville, and he did a lot of stuff there, and I could say, oh, my grandfather's Bob Mosteller, the sign maker in Millville, and they would know who that was, but they may not know me, and they may not know my dad, but they might know my dad's dad, right? So who your father or your father is very important. Okay, so meeting Jesus, right? The first time, you see this a little bit different in the Gospels, right? And we're gonna talk about this just a little bit. Is John's gospel is a little bit different because John was probably an eyewitness to all of these things, being an early disciple of Christ and also a follower of John the Baptist. So what happened is Andrew and John were devout followers of John the Baptist, and they were his disciples, and when he was in their area and he was baptizing people, they were following John the Baptist. And then he said, behold the Lamb of God. And he pointed out Jesus and he said, you should go follow him. So they left John the Baptist to go follow Jesus in part-time ministry, right? Because what was the point of John the Baptist? Was he the Messiah? No, he was supposed to be there to present the way for the Messiah, to present the way for Christ, right? Prepare it for him. And so when they found Jesus, the only thing they could do was leave John and follow Jesus. And so Andrew, Peter's brother, finds Peter, says, come with me, we have found the Messiah, right? So here we go. I'm going to read it right here out of John chapter 1. Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, was one of the two who heard what John had said and who had followed Jesus. The first thing Andrew did was to find his brother Simon and tell him, "We have found the Messiah," that is the Christ. And he brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, son of John," or son of Jonah. "You will be called Cephas," which when translated is Peter. So it's very interesting. The Gospel of John, we get a different experience than in the other Gospels, where you kind of just see this boat, right? And Jesus gets on the boat to speak to the crowd, and then tells him to drop his net into, or he sees Peter fishing and says, "Follow me, I'll make you a fisher of men." Right? We get different experiences, and it's not that they're conflicting stories, right? It's that it's the perspective of the story, right? Mr. Kim, you've been going to this church a very long time, correct? I've been only going here a little more than a year, right? Your perspective on things, like when maybe Captain Harry first showed up, is going to be different than mine because he was already here when I showed up, right? And so it's not that our stories are wrong, they're just from a different perspective, right? You already were going here, and then he showed up, right? You were already part of the story, right? I'm a character later on. The Gospels written by Matthew, Mark, and Luke, right, maybe from the perspective just a little bit different. John was there from the very beginning. So here we go. This is going to be from Luke chapter 5, and this is how Peter meets Jesus there. The backstory is that he had already been following Jesus in part-time ministry, right? And so we'll read this. Can you see it okay? I'm gonna read it out loud though. One day, as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesareth, the people were crowding around him and listening to the word of God. He saw at the water's edge 2 boats, left there by the fishermen, who were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from shore. Then he sat down and taught the people from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep water and let down the nets for a catch." And Simon answered, "Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I will let down the nets." When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. They signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help, and they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man." For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken. And so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. Remember how we talked about they had a fishing partnership with James and John? Then Jesus said to Simon, "Don't be afraid. From now on, you will fish for people." So they pulled their boats up to the shore, left everything, and followed him. So this is a turning point for Simon Peter. He goes from a part-time follower of Jesus, just as Andrew and John were fishermen, but part-time followers of John the Baptist. And now they start their full-time ministry with Jesus, right? I guess you could say it would be like teaching Sunday school and then going and becoming a full-time pastor, right? Look, kind of the same thing. All right. So we learned about how he met Jesus, and Jesus gave him a nickname, Peter, right? So Peter, it means rock, right? And when you get a nickname or a new name from God, it means that you're on a journey to do something special, right? Abraham becomes Abraham. Sarai becomes Sarah. Isaac becomes Israel, right? And when you get a new name from God, you're going to do something awesome, right? And so Jesus gives him the name Peter, which means rock. It comes as a very much of a surprise. He doesn't just always call him Peter. Jesus changes the tone of the conversation based upon how he refers to him, right? Sometimes he calls him Simon, and sometimes he calls him Peter, right? I guess you could say it's like when your parents call you by one name instead of the other, right? When your mom's just calling you, what does she call? Does she call you anything different when she's upset versus when she's just asking you to come here?
I guess she will also say my last name.
Ooh.
Yeah.
So instead of just she say Sunju or Sunju Kim?
Yes, she'll say Kim Sunju.
Oh yeah, Kim Sunju. I forgot backwards, right? Yeah. So yeah. Well, so when she's upset with you, she says the whole thing, right? But when she just wants you to like come here or wants help or something, then it's just Sunju, right? So, it's kind of the same thing. Peter gave him this nickname, and so when he calls him Simon, it's about like his failure. He wanted him to step up and do something, but he failed. Or he's referring to his old self before he found Christ, right? Because when he found Christ, he immediately got called Peter, right? And then when he calls him Peter, he's trying to instill some sort of leadership, right? Or is he trying to instill some sort of purpose or authority into him? Because Christ wanted him to be the leader of the disciples, because you cannot have a group without a leader, right? You always have to have somebody in charge, right? Somebody, they may not be like the end-all be-all dictatorship leader, but there always has to be a leader, somebody who's pointing the way for the group, and that man was going to be Simon Peter. So you'll see in many parts of the in the New Testament, when he's calling him a certain name, pay attention to it, right? Because he's it's almost it's like nonverbal communication, right? Just like your mom, right? When she's saying Sanju, Iliwa, right? When instead of it's like Kim Sanju Iliwa, right? Then it's going to be different, right? I'm in trouble, right? Probably doesn't happen very much to you, but I'm just trying to give an example. And sometimes, right, we get nicknames that we have to grow into. So you're like, why is there a baseball player up on the screen, right? Just an example. This was actually in the book I'm reading, 12 Ordinary Men. This guy's name is Oral Hershiser. Never heard of him before. Apparently he's famous. When he started playing baseball, he was kind of a very timid, scrawny-looking pitcher, right? He was pretty good, but he just had a lot of like timidness to him. He didn't have a lot of veracity. And sometimes as a professional athlete, you need to be a little more abrupt about things. So he had a manager who actually gave him a nickname, the Bulldog, right? And you got a nickname like that, right? People kind of give you a little bit more respect, or maybe it just changes a mindset within you. Maybe Jesus, by giving Peter the nickname the Rock, he was trying to instill something in him, let him grow into a nickname instead of him just already being like that, right? So when this gentleman was given the name Bulldog, he was not a bulldog, but it's something that he very much grew into as he got older. Okay, Simon Peter in the Bible. This is probably going to be one of the longest lessons I do on a single disciple, because Simon Peter is literally mentioned all over the place. I don't think there's a single disciple mentioned more. So we see him in the very beginning catching fish in Luke 5, right? He receives his nickname from Jesus in John 1. In Matthew 14, he walks on water, right? They look out the boat and they see Jesus walking on water, and Jesus calls to him and says, come out here with me. And Simon Peter, he starts walking on water, and then he takes his eyes off Jesus and he falls, right? We see him in Acts. He's a very prominent figure throughout the beginning of Acts. We see him at the transfiguration of Christ. I'm actually going to do a break after the first 4 disciples, and we're going to talk about the transfiguration. This is where he takes 3 disciples, and he goes up to a mountaintop, and he reveals God to them. And there's also Moses and Elijah there. So it's a very important part of Christ. And Jesus tells him to keep it a secret until he's resurrected. So we'll talk about the transfiguration as a whole separate study because there's a lot going on there. We see Simon Peter at the washing of the feet. We see him as the one who denied Christ 3 times. We see Simon Peter cutting off someone's ear in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? So he obviously had a little, I don't know, what's the word, veracity to him, right? Maybe he started living up to that Peter nickname. And we see him many, many more times. I ran out of time making this slideshow, and I just couldn't fit it all in there because he's all over the place. So something to know about Simon Peter, I think I talked about this when we did the book of John. He's kind of an all or nothing kind of guy, and that's good and bad. So at the washing of the feet, right, Jesus comes up to him and he says he's going to wash his feet. And he says, "No, Lord, you will never wash my feet." And Jesus says to him, "If I don't wash your feet, you have no place with me," right? And he says, "Oh, Jesus, don't just wash my feet, wash my head and my hands too," right? So he's all or nothing. At first he's, "No, don't wash my feet. Oh, just wash me all over, Lord," right? And so he's all or nothing there. We also see with him denying Christ. Jesus says, "You will deny me 3 times." And he says, "I will never deny you." And then he just denies him blatantly 3 times while Jesus is in with the Pilate, right? He's in there with Pilate, and Peter's kind of outside waiting for John to come out, and they all ask, "Are you one of his disciples too?" No, not me. Right? It doesn't even kind of this like, I don't know what you're talking about. So we see Simon Peter all over the New Testament. And one reason I wanted to do this series is I think we kind of confuse the disciples a lot, right? There's 12 characters. That's a lot for a book to have, right? If you were just reading a novel, 3 or 4 main characters is enough to keep track of. 12 is a little bit too much. And the Bible, of course, is not a novel. It's not fiction. This is something that actually happened. But it's a good way for us to keep track of the disciples is by learning who they are and where they were, so that we can be better teachers, stewards, and worshipers of Christ. All right, so books by Peter, we only have 2. So we have 1 Peter and 2 Peter. They are both epistles. They're really, really good content in both of them. And so those are the only ones that we have, but we'll talk about some of Peter's fruits, right? We talk a lot of times about your fruit, and when you bear fruit, the seeds of that fruit bear more fruit. We're going to be talking about Peter's fruit here as well. All right, and then, so after Christ's resurrection and ascension, right? So the whole reason that Jesus had disciples is so that when he ascended into heaven, he would have people to carry on his ministry. If he didn't have anyone here to carry on that ministry, everything he did would just fall away. So it was very important that the disciples had a leader and somebody to carry that on. And so where do we see Peter after the ascension? So we see him healing people in Acts 3 and Acts 9. So we see him healing people in the name of Jesus, right? He's carrying on exactly what Jesus did by healing people, right? He opens the church to Gentiles. So what is a Gentile? A non-Jewish person, right? So were we ever Jews? No. I was never a Jew, right? I don't think anybody in my family was Jewish. But don't you think that the Savior of the world wants to save everyone and not just the Jewish people, right? And Peter really opens up this concept of God and Jesus for everyone, right? Not just for the Jewish people, but he's for the Gentile too. He's for everyone. Jesus is for everybody, right? And without Peter, I don't know if that concept would have ever been taken on. So we have Peter to thank for that. Like many of the disciples and people of his time that were passionate for Christ, he was also arrested several times, right? Many of the Roman authorities did not like the fact of Jesus. So did the Pharisees. They all hated Jesus, and so they were arrested for it. He also escapes from prison, right? So that's pretty cool. He's actually coming in to go see some of the other disciples, and they hear his voice and see him, and one of them says it must be his ghost or his angel, right? But it was actually him because they knew he was imprisoned. So Peter's wife actually comes to join him on his ministry for Christ. Because I think it was Emperor Nero at the time really didn't like this whole Christian movement, he decided to start killing and crucifying people. So his wife, this is non-biblical, this is historical context. She was actually crucified in front of him, and the historical context says that he told her to remember the Lord while she was being crucified.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Were those historical sources? What was the purpose for it? Why were those written? Was it from who?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure how they know all of that. We're going to talk about Peter's scribe here in a little bit, because a lot of things were written down. The Romans were really good at killing people, right? And I'm sure that they were also good at keeping records. So they probably kept records of who they killed. Why did they write this down? I don't know. But they also had people following them around that wrote down everything, right? The Pharisees had scribes that would write things down. Many times, with these manuscripts and whatnot, that was somebody's job. They would go and they would write down or copy exactly what somebody else had written, right? So that's actually how we have much of the New Testament. Somebody would copy a letter that was written, right? And then they would just keep copying it, and they would take it to other places and copy it. So it was just a really big thing to write things down back then. Now we would videotape everything, right? We'd get the camera out. How many times, you can't go anywhere without somebody snapping a video or a picture, right? So everything was just written down because that was the way. Very good question. Let's see. Peter was a very early church leader. So, because he was the leader of disciples, he keeps carrying that on, and he's very credited with a lot of things in the very early church, right? He kept the engine going. He was actually crucified in Rome, and by Emperor Nero, and he did not want to die like Christ, so he was crucified upside down because he thought he was unworthy to die the exact same way as Christ. I don't know exactly what that does for you as far as changing the whole crucifixion process. I don't know if it makes it worse or better because you're still dying of crucifixion, but does it prolong the process? I'm not exactly sure. Because in crucifixion, you're hanging there and it's pulling up on your diaphragm so you can't breathe. I'm not sure what exactly it does when you're hanging upside down, except for a lot of blood rushes to your head. I don't know if you would pass out or not, or if it just makes it longer. Anyways, so he was crucified upside down. And this is a little bit out of order. He preaches at the Pentecost to over 3,000 people, brings them to Christ, and baptizes them. So that's pretty awesome, right? We talk about fruit, right? Him preaching to 3,000 people and bringing them to Jesus, that's a whole lot of fruit to harvest in one speech, right? So we can be thankful for Simon Peter. And as we talk about fruit, who's Mark? Right? We hear about Mark. We don't really hear about him in the Bible. He's a big contributor to parts of the Bible. Right? He is the author of the Gospel of Mark. He's also known as John Mark. And he also authored Acts. And so basically, Mark was a traveling companion and a scribe of Peter. So when you ask about how are these things, known about, Mark was following Peter around, and his job was a scribe. So he was to write down probably everything, right? And many of his writings got turned into the New Testament. So we have John Mark here as one of Peter's fruits, right? And, part of fruit is it keeps multiplying. So originally we have Andrew, right? And Andrew brings Simon Peter to Jesus, right? So now Peter is Andrew's fruit, right? And then Mark becomes a follower of Peter. So now Mark is Peter's fruit, but he's also Andrew's fruit, right? So when you start planting seeds and bearing fruit, that fruit will multiply and multiply and multiply over time. So that's all I have for the disciple Peter.